Could the Biden administration be posturing to decriminalize cannabis? The Department of Health and Human Services is recommending the DEA significantly loosen federal restrictions on marijuana by demoting it from a Schedule 1 to a Schedule 3 drug. Notably, the administration did not advise cannabis be entirely removed from the Controlled Substances Act, Politico reports.
As a Schedule 1 drug, cannabis is currently grouped with recreational drugs like heroin, MDMA, LSD, and bath salts. When asked about the drug review process, White House Press Secretary Jean-Pierre told reporters, "We're just not going to comment on that." Joining us now to break down what this would mean for the larger movement for decriminalization of drugs and drug sentencing reform is Executive Director of Drug Policy Alliance, Frederique. Kassandra, welcome to Rising. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So why do you think the Biden administration declined to comment on this after this report from Politico? Jean-Pierre's statement was pretty final there.
I can't begin to imagine what the Biden administration is thinking. But I think what we do know is that this is a conversation that's going to keep coming up as a majority of Americans believe that drug criminalization isn't an effective way to deal with drugs. And so the Biden administration should continue to prepare to continue to get an answer for this question, because we see that drug possession arrests are the number one arrests in the country. We know that possession arrests also really, because of possession criminalization, it really hampers people's ability to get access to healthcare and supports for addiction. And as we know, the conversation about the reform of cannabis policy is important, but it's not the full part of the conversation. And I think Americans are really pushing for us to have a more comprehensive conversation about decriminalization and drugs in this country. So I predict that the press secretary will be asked this question as the Biden administration continues to look towards reforms.
So it seems that about 88% of adults in the United States say marijuana should be legal for medical or recreational use. It's still the majority that believe it should be legal for recreational use. Let's get down to brass tacks here. Is marijuana as bad as the other scheduled drugs? Is it as bad as the other drugs that are criminalized in the United States? What are your thoughts?
I find that conversation is not helpful. I think one of the things for us around cannabis is that it is the drug that most Americans use or admit to using. Over 100 million people talk about their use of cannabis. I think the conversation that we've had around how we've used the scheduling and the criminalization around cannabis, a lot of those conversations are the same kinds of conversations we can have about the usefulness and the feasibility and the viability of using criminalization as a tool to deal with other drugs. Now, cannabis is more mainstream, more people have experiences with it. And so I think that's part of the reason why you see it leading the conversation on drug policy reform. But I think the dichotomy of a good or bad drug really confuses the conversation about what is the appropriate way to deal with drugs in our society.
I've heard the argument before that marijuana needs to be decriminalized or given a lower classification so that it can be studied more thoroughly. We have seen some research come out in the past couple of years. Just yesterday, Columbia University dropped a study finding that habitual marijuana users have higher levels of lead and cadmium in their blood. There's been other research that suggests that it can induce psychosis in people who have dormant mental illnesses. So I'm just curious, if they were to change this from a Schedule 1 to a Schedule 3 drug, would we be able to see more research, more studies being done on the potential negative side effects of it?
I think so. I think so much of our conversation and the knowledge that is often pushed about the detrimental impacts of cannabis are based in junk science. I think we've used junk science for a really long time to push political motivations around drug criminalization. I think with moving cannabis to Schedule 3, it does open up more research opportunities. And I think one of the things that is really important for us, and we try to keep people to understand, is that the research that we have oftentimes is very limited in scope, and it's not speaking to regulated cannabis, right? So part of the reason why people push for the regulation of cannabis is that we know what's in it, that we create health infrastructure around what kind of cannabis goes in, what are the substances that we can do, what is the potency. That's all conversations for regulation. And until we have that, it's really difficult for us to really look at the research and see based on the methodology, because so many of the samples that people are using are sometimes they're not easy to be compared.
I want to talk a little bit about how this is a racial justice issue. So 62% of those admitted to state prison for drug offenses are Black. That is an insane proportion considering the population and the breakdown racially in the United States. Now, we've talked about how marijuana is a drug that's used by pretty much everyone in the United States. So how the law is applied is just as important as what the law is, because it seems that this law is used disproportionately to put Black Americans in jail. So when we consider, the way that the law is applied, does that suggest that maybe we should reconsider having this law at the federal level at all? Could that be a motivation of the Biden administration here, that while this law exists, it's not applied evenly, and maybe it could be argued very well that it's used as a tool in racial policing?
I think one of the most important things about us studying what the Biden administration is doing right now is the Biden administration has admitted that there was disproportionate enforcement of drug policies. It's no secret. It's very clear. And the Biden administration, even during his campaign when he was candidate, Biden talked about the racial implications of the drug war and the way that drug criminalization disproportionately impacts certain groups of people, and particularly Black Americans. While cannabis is used as a way to criminalize groups of people, we cannot divorce the conversation of drug policy and policing, because it is policing that and their targeted enforcement that is creating the racial disparities into these places. Because as we said earlier, most people that are using cannabis in this country goes across racial lines. There are a lot of white folks that are using cannabis that are not facing the same kind of policing in their neighborhoods. And so the Biden administration has rightfully couched a lot of their cannabis reform conversation as a means of dealing with criminal justice reform and racial equity. But unfortunately, this decision right now around rescheduling as opposed to descheduling cannabis is woefully inadequate to deal with the comprehensive nature of the racist history of cannabis enforcement in this country.
Is there any effect that the reclassification of cannabis might have on the commercial industry? We've seen more states decriminalizing marijuana. That's a booming industry in both Colorado and Washington State and Washington, D.C. How would this potentially affect those industries?
So I think there are a lot of questions that are still up in the air. Most notably, what we do know, we feel safe to predict now, is that with the rescheduling of cannabis, businesses will be able to make regular business tax deductions. But the industry is still at risk because cannabis is still illegal federally. And what we also know, and it has been important to advocates as well as been a talking point of the Biden administration, is the need for a fair playing field for smaller businesses. And a rescheduling does not necessarily create the conditions for a fair playing field for smaller businesses.
So I want to turn to maybe what we could do moving forward policy-wise. Are there any recommendations to make sure that when the drug is decriminalized, we don't see the continuation of the majority of places where you can go brick and mortar and purchase marijuana being white owned? I think it's a part of, restorative justice and reparations to some degree to ensure that those most affected by drug policies have the opportunity economically once it's decriminalized. Are there any recommendations your organization is working with or that you quite like policy-wise moving forward to make sure this goes smoothly?
So I just want to make sure that we emphasize for your viewers that what the Biden administration is proposing does not decriminalize cannabis. But in a future world where we're having a conversation about the comprehensive decriminalization of cannabis, we are working with groups all across the country, small farmers, small business owners, criminal justice groups, economic justice groups, to really figure out in this moment where we're creating a new industry, how do we make sure that the industry regulations and rules lend itself to promoting fairness? And so there are groups like cannabis regulators of color, which are people that are who have been administrators in cannabis markets who have learned from what they've seen, like, hey, this actually doesn't work. Or Minority Cannabis Business Association is another organization doing this work. There are large national organizations like Marijuana Policy Project or NORML or my organization, Drug Policy Alliance. There is a federal coalition called the Marijuana Justice Coalition that is working on comprehensive cannabis reform that includes making sure that the regulations that are put forward promote fairness and equitability or equity in building this new industry.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Kassandra, Frederique, thank you so much for joining us. We'll be back with more Rising after this.
Thank you for having me.